Cuff me outside so the child won't see it. That's what my father said to the two FCC agents standing in the living room of our house as they arrested my father. This happened one day here at home in 1982. My mother was standing between the office and the dining room while I watched what was unfolding from the hallway, and then they took him away. My father was operating a clandestine anti-Castro radio station called Radio Antorcha Martiana. This was years before Radio Martí, the broadcast station that was later sponsored by the United States. The program from my father's station included selections of patriotic music and messages for the Cuban people. My father operated it from a small room that was packed to the brim with equipment. Outside in the front yard attached to the porch, he had hung an antenna that could be seen from afar. It was the same antenna that was used to raise the Cuban flag when the Pope came to visit Miami in 1987. I talk about that story in my previous video called You're American, I'm Cuban, and Grandfather is a Spaniard. So they arrested my father, and as soon as he was released and all this ended, back in 82, he continued with his anti-Castro activities just like he had done before. As a kid, I remember my dad having me talk into the microphone, sending words of encouragement to the Cuban people on air. Years later, in 1990, my dad was raided again and his station was shut down, and he was fined $1,000. My dad was determined to fight against the Cuban communist regime for decades since he set foot on American soil back in 1962. The first thing he did when he got here was join the army. He trained in Fort Jackson, South Carolina, and was also at Fort Knox. The soldiers were comprised of Cubans trained for select missions during the Cuban Missile Crisis years, and they were later sent to Central America awaiting to invade Cuba. But a deal was brokered between Kennedy and the Russians, and the threat was averted. My dad soon found himself back in Miami as with the rest of the Cuban exiles who were disappointed in Kennedy. Many counter-revolutionary groups began to form in those days, with many exiles still looking to topple Castro. In 1966 through 67, there was a plot that my father found himself in the Florida Keys, comprised of Cuban and Haitian exiles and American soldiers of fortune, and three-letter agencies were also involved. The plot was to launch from the Keys, invade Haiti, and topple their dictator, and with that, gather Haitian support for an invasion of Cuba. But they were arrested before they got on their way and were taken to jail, then court, where most were released except for the leaders. One time my father told me, and I paraphrase, that being arrested and fighting for freedom and for the dignity of people's human rights is nothing to be ashamed of. He was making a distinction for me to understand the difference, which I did. My father always told me that none of this was my problem, that I'm an American, just as he had mentioned to me on the sidewalk so many years ago at my grandparents' place in Little Havana. So I lived my life like any kid growing up in the 80s here in Miami, riding bikes with friends, reading comic books, and playing video games and so on. But at the same time, growing up in Miami among the Cuban exile community, you learn additional nuances about the world around you in particular ways, about those ideologies that would use politics and force or violence to rob people of their freedoms. Back then, you could not help but stumble on the anti-communist sentiment anywhere you'd go. There were various Cuban radio stations that people tuned into at all hours, and they'd keep the exile community up to date on all the latest happenings. At weekend family gatherings, conversations would always turn to issues concerning family and friends on the island, along with the latest of what was going on. This focus was repeated in the homes of Cuban exiles all across Dade County. And likewise, Miami had endless Cuban cafeterias that sprung up everywhere on corners across the county. People stopping in for a café cubano or a smoke inevitably got to talking about the situation in Cuba. It was ubiquitous at the barber shop, the auto parts store, and just about everywhere. Adding to it all, it was the 80s. Hollywood movies were coming out with very American themes of freedom and anti-communist themes such as Rambo, Red Dawn, and the list is long. Now, some people, never having been exposed to certain urgencies, may question Cubans as to why they believe what they do. And I've ran into people that take for granted any number of things. To be fair, that would be true for people in general according to their particular circumstances. When people question why Cubans take the positions they do, it's a matter of slipping on others' shoes and walking a mile. Anecdotally, you can always find outliers as people are complex, but Cuban exiles are not fond of communism or anything that approximates it. There's countless stories of families torn apart due to what occurred and continues to on the island. In the case of my family on the paternal side, they had a store, my grandparents did. It was a small shop that sold textiles, jewelry, and toys. And the store was confiscated by the communists, and then my grandfather was placed to work in the fields. And my grandmother was placed to work at another store that was likewise confiscated from its previous owners. At the time, my father, barely 20 years old, was beaten by the communists. On one occasion, simply for laughing at a fire that had broken out at a chicken farm. At best, they suspected him of laughing and therefore a beating. The stories are endless, coming from thousands of families. And not just during the first years of the revolution, but ever since. When you get burned, you learn to pay attention and not touch the stove again.